Hello everyone, welcome to a new DIY video on the 2014 Kia Sportage with the 2-liter diesel engine. And today we will be replacing the lower engine mount on our car, also known as the roll rod bracket. As a quick summary, we're doing this because I believe this is the culprit for a knocking noise that I've been hearing for the past couple of months. A noise that's noticeable at a certain speed, around 50 kilometers an hour, and also more noticeable when I steer to the right. It should be a fairly straightforward operation, but as always, I'll give you all the necessary details that you need in order to do this job yourself if you have to. So enjoy the video, and at the end, if you liked it, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. Thank you very much. Now at the time of filming, which is October 2023, the car has done almost 186,000 kilometers and it's about 9.5 years old. And here we are on a little test drive with me trying to reproduce that knocking noise. And it's somewhat noticeable at around 50 kilometers an hour. Hopefully you heard it. It's a small thumping noise, dup, 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 dup. And it is also more pronounced when I load the front left wheel, i.e. when I make a turn to the right. If you listen carefully, you'll identify it. So let's go back to the garage and tackle the subject. And back at the workplace, first thing we need to do is remove the metal shield, which is held in place with 6 bolts and nuts. And I'll remove it off camera for the sake of speed. However, as a note, taking a look at the lower engine mount, you see there's fairly sufficient room to use spanners and torque wrenches and whatnot to remove this nut, this bolt, and the bolts here. So the removal of the shield is optional, but I'm doing it anyways because I want to take the opportunity and look underneath the car to make sure that everything else is in order. And after removing the shield, let me now tell you the story of why I think this is the actual problem. So starting from the noise and the observation that it's more audible when I load the front left wheel, I had a couple of options to consider. The first one was that the front left wheel was not completely circular. Okay, maybe the rubber or the rim had become slightly oval and they were generating noise, which is why I took all 4 rims to be straightened out, if you will, to a special garage. And then I started swapping wheels in between them. So the current wheel that's on the front left used to be on the front right, and before that on the rear right. And since I did all these swaps and the noise was still present, I ruled out the wheels or the rims as being the possible culprits. Now I also ruled out bushings and ball joints because I've already posted the video with their replacement, so those are brand new and couldn't have been the cause. I also ruled out any issues with the steering because the tie rods are brand new as well, because I already posted the video. I also ruled out any issues with the shock absorber or the spring because I took them to a garage to have them checked, and the results were they are in good shape, which meant 2 remaining culprits, either something related to the wheel bearing or something related to the front left CV shaft going from the transmission to the wheel. And without making a video of this, I took some time one day, removed the wheel, removed the front left drive shaft, check the state of the wheel bearing, which is absolutely fine, no play, no issues. And also check the state of the front left CV shaft. My hypothesis was the inner CV joint was the problem, which is why I went and removed the boot from the inner CV joint, cleaned up all the old grease, which was looking fine, applied brand new grease, reinstalled everything back together, and the noise went away just very slightly. So it's good that I did change the grease, but it also meant that was not the culprit. At which point I was a bit stuck, and I remained stuck up until the moment I edited the Sportage's brake hose video, which I've already published as well. And now I'm gonna give you a small clip from that video, which actually made me think, aha, it's the lower mount that might actually be the culprit. Okay, press the brakes. Release. Press the brakes. Release. Press the brakes. Release. And shut the engine off. Thank you. Now, if you paid close attention to that small clip, you noticed how the engine block actually moved forwards and backwards as the brake was applied and released. And it seemed to me that that motion was a bit too much. It shouldn't really move that much. And the only thing that's preventing or allowing the engine block to move in that direction is this lower engine mount, okay? And now let me try with the lever to see how much play it has. So I stick it underneath, and yeah, you can pretty much see there's quite a lot of play there. On the sides as well. Okay, look at that. It's quite a lot. So here at the back, there's some play as well. But most importantly, you see the motion here at the front. So what I actually think is happening is because the rubber is old and worn out and no longer holding properly, it's allowing some metal part of the damper to hit the chassis, either at the back or here the inner sleeve is hitting against the outer sleeve because the rubber is no longer providing sufficient separation between the two. And if you take a closer look, you can see that the rubber is cracked. Yeah, it's quite cracked. So this may well be the reason why we hear our noise. So let's go ahead and replace it. Now the first thing to do is to clean the bolt head, the nut, and the two bolts at the back, but they're fairly clean already. So then the next step would be to apply some penetrating oil on the nut, on the bolt, and on the two rear bolts, and let them soak in for a while. These being similar to bushing bolts, they don't usually get touched, and it may prove somewhat troublesome to remove. Now, before I remove anything, you may be asking yourselves, does the engine block need to be supported when removing this particular engine mount? And the answer is effectively no, because the weight of the engine sits on the two engine mounts which are there at the top. Can't really show them on video, but they're closer to the top of the engine. As I explained, the main function of this particular mount is just to limit the rocking of the engine block back and forth. So it should be safe to remove by simply removing the nut and the three bolts. Now the nut and the bolt head for the front bushing are 17mm hex, and the two bolts at the back are 14mm hex. So let's start with the nut first. Use a spanner to hold the bolt in place. And it came out quite easily. And the bolt's coming out as well. And look, it's in very good shape, except here at the back, but this is just superficial. I'll clean it before reinstallation. And that's good because I hadn't sourced a new one. Also note the thread locker, so we will have to reapply thread locker before reinstallation. Store the nut and bolt somewhere safe. And let's do the rear bolts as well. The one from the right side as you're looking towards the front of the car. Okay, it's out. Here it is. Also looks pretty good. And the second one which looks fairly good as well. And here is our lower engine mount. And now let's just take a look at the part that we removed. So visually it doesn't seem to have too many cracks on the rubber. The rear side seemed okay, but the one at the front, I've already showed you that it's worn out quite a lot. Some other notes over here, back there, you have the part number, which I will read to you, 21959-2S000. Some Hyundai Kia logos, and some other logos, and that's pretty much it. So this is how the part is supposed to look like. And here is the new part, which I sourced from Lemforder. And if you take a look, it looks identical. But not just that. Over here, you have the same part number, so we know the parts fit well. But more interesting, take a look here. You see where the aluminum has been scratched off, but still you can ever so slightly tell that here there was a Hyundai logo, where my finger is pointing, and here on the other side there was a Kia logo. Same marks on this other side as with the old part. See? And this is where the logos went. And that pretty much leads me to a simple conclusion, that it is Lemforder who is the OEM for this particular engine mount. So the fact that we have this Lemforder replacement should guarantee that it behaves well in the future. So we're ready to install it. But now, before installing anything, let's spend a bit of time to clean up the installation area where we used the penetrating oil earlier. So with some brake cleaner, and we wipe off the dirt. Next, let's take each of the 3 bolts and with a metal brush, preferably attached to a drill, let's clean them up. Okay, so that's one. Looks pretty good. Here is the second one. And lastly, here is the cleaned up bolt that connects the engine to the bracket. So all the rust is gone and the thread locker marks gone as well. So it's looking pretty good, meaning that right now all of these 3 can go back to the car. And let's start by putting the new mount into position. Note the orientation. You see it's not symmetrical top down. And just wiggle it in place. Doesn't take too much effort. Now let's put the bolts to position, starting with the big one. And now I'm gonna make one observation that I made on the bushings video as well. You can apply some anti-seize on this part of the bolt to make sure it doesn't seize in place inside the bushing sleeve here in case you ever need to remove it again. But definitely do not apply anti-seize or any kind of grease on the threads, because then you'll over torque the bolt and risk breaking it. And as anti-seize, as always, I'm using my Ceratec. So something like this. And the bolt slides in easily. As for the rear bolts, use both anti-seize on the non-threaded part and thread locker on the threaded part. Begin by tightening by hand as much as you can. Here's the second bolt, similar fashion. And when you can no longer tighten by hand, use a small ratchet. The whole point of tightening by hand is to avoid cross-threading when installing the bolts. That's one. And that's two. Now the torque for these two bolts is between 49 and 63.7 Newton meters, and I'm going with about 60. That is one. And that is two. And lastly, we have to tighten the nut on the bolt. Remember, what actually holds the bushing in place is not the body of the bolt, which is why it was safe to apply anti-seize on the body of the bolt, but rather the clamping force on these two lips when the nut and the bolt are properly tight. So, apply some medium strength thread locker, just as it was before. And I went and cleaned the nut off camera. And again, we install it by hand to avoid any cross-threading. As for the torque on the nut, by the way, torque on the nut, not on the bolt, I found conflicting information in the manual. One variant says between 88 and 108 Newton meters, another says between 108 and 128 for the exact same bolt. So I'm gonna go with about 110. So again, we hold the bolt in place. And I'm having to use a crowfoot extension because I can't use the torque wrench directly because it hits on this part of the transmission. And that's it. Remember that the crowfoot should be perpendicular to the direction of the torque wrench to have a reasonably accurate value. And with that done, we're pretty much finished. Just need to take the car out on a test drive and see if the problem is solved. And so here we are a little bit later on a short test drive with a right hand bend. And the left one for good measure. And the truth is, I still feel a little bit of a knocking noise, but it is reduced from what it was before. So we know at least part of the problem was the damper that we replaced. So it is good that we've actually succeeded in doing this job. Now I'll keep the conclusions part as short as possible. First and foremost, at the time of filming this part of the video, we have sold our Sportage, which means that this is the last video that I'll be making for this particular car and engine. Over time, I received a lot of positive feedback on the videos I made on the Sportage, so thank you all very much for enjoying them and finding them useful. Coming back to this particular job, as you've seen, it's fairly simple, much simpler than other jobs that I did. It's just a case of removing 3 bolts and replacing the part and putting the bolts back together. Obviously, pay attention if the car is old and the part hasn't been replaced, that you may struggle with a bit of rust when removing the bolts. Cost-wise, this OEM part was about 45 euros. Genuine one would be about double. And all in all, the cost for a dealer to put a genuine part with labor would stretch to 100 to 150 euros, at least here in Romania. But all in all, if you notice some low frequency vibrations when driving, it's a good idea to check if this part is worn out and replace it accordingly. It does have a positive impact on the comfort of the vehicle, as well as the lifetimes of the other 2 engine mounts, because if this wears down badly, the engine block is gonna move more on those mounts and wear those down faster. And with that said, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. I would be very, very grateful. I wish you all a lovely day, and I'll see you next time. Take care and goodbye.